So we're going to travel into time to the 20th and 21st century. Okay, that should be good. So I'm speaking to you today from a triple position as a Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada postdoctoral fellow in history at the University of Quebec, Montreal, research director of the Museum of Jewish Montreal, and a research associate with the Concordia Institute for Canadian Jewish Studies. My interest in Sephardic Jews began over a decade ago when I moved from Toronto to Montreal to do an undergraduate degree at McGill. This was the first time I encountered the idea of Jewish difference. I heard about fights between Sephardic and Ashkenazi kids at a local high school, and I heard my grandmother call her Moroccan neighbors Arabs. This curiosity in Jewish difference led me on adventures around the world, to study competition in Sephardic and Ashkenazi synagogue architecture in Europe, Mizrahi film in Israel, and double diaspora in the literature and film of Arab Jews in Canada, France, and Israel. Today I am back to the first location that sparked my interest, Moroccan Jewish history in Montreal. In my presentation today, I will discuss how the process of mapping can help make visible Moroccan Jewish history in Montreal, a history that has been largely invisible in Canadian Jewish studies and Canadian and Quebec history. First, I would like to discuss mapping as a methodological framework. We are living in a world of unprecedented movement and migration of people and information. In the past, we have used maps to help us secure territories to establish stable roots. But today, technology of mapping can at best help to reorient us in the chaos and enable new interpretations. In their book, Elsewhere, Mapping New Cartographies of Networks and Territories, Janet Abrams and Peter Hall tell us that mapping has emerged in the information age as a means to make the complex accessible, the hidden visible, and the unmappable mappable. While we might have a tendency to see maps as a mirror of reality, objective scientific representations of territory as it really is, this ignores the variety of choices that a cartographer makes in choosing how to make her representation. As such, James Corner draws our attention to the agency of mapping. He argues that mapping is a creative process that can help emancipate potentials, enrich experiences, and diversify worlds. It can help reveal things that may have been undermined or invisible to us. Through my work at the Museum of Jewish Montreal, a web and street-based museum without four walls, I am actively involved in making Montreal Jewish history visible through mapping. We do this in several ways. One, our website geolocates sites of importance such as synagogues, residences of Jewish artists, business leaders, or writers, and we present them in online exhibits such as these. We create digital walking tours that you can navigate from your mobile phone or computer. We lead in-person walking tours of Jewish Montreal. And we bring locations of Jewish life to the public through pop-up exhibits and public presentations. These techniques have been tremendously successful in connecting Jews and non-Jews to the Jewish history of this city. What remains a significant challenge, however, is that Montreal's Jewish community is incredibly diverse. So when we are speaking of the Jewish history of Montreal, which Jews are we speaking about, and which Jewish history? Montreal's Jewish community of just over 90,000 Jews is divided roughly into three: Ashkenazi Jews, from Orthodox to atheist, and including relatively recent immigrants from France, Israel, Argentina, and the former Soviet Union; Hasidic Jews, mostly Ashkenazi, but also some Sephardim; and Sephardim, mostly from Morocco, but also including Jews from Iraq, Turkey, and elsewhere. There is also a tiny population of Ethiopian Jews, but I'm not sure which category they fall into under these statistics. The major Jewish immigration to Montreal occurred between 1900 and 1930. Fueled by the mass immigration of Eastern European Jews fleeing pogroms, military draft, and poverty, the Jewish population of Montreal increased from around 7,000 in 1901 to over 60,000 in 1931. In 1914, Yiddish was the third most spoken language in Montreal after English and French. These Jews settled close to the Montreal port and later moved up St. Lawrence Boulevard into the neighborhoods of Plateau and Mile End. Although Canada's first Jewish settlers, who came with the British conquest of New France after 1760, followed Sephardic traditions and established a Spanish and Portuguese congregation, when we speak about Sephardim in Montreal today, we are often speaking about North African Jewish immigrants who arrived in Canada after 1956. Although they toyed with different forms of identification, the leaders of this community ultimately decided to unite themselves under the rubric of Sephardic Jews, differing, for example, from the development of the term Mizrahim in Israel. Sephardic is a deliberate identity construction by Moroccan Jews chosen above other categories such as North African, Moroccan, or Francophone to distinguish themselves from French-Canadian majority of Quebec and the established Anglophone Ashkenazi Jewish community of Montreal. The Association Francophone Séfarade, a predecessor of today's CSUQ, Communauté Séfarade Unifiée de Québec, formed to advocate for basic services which were denied to Francophone Sephardim when they arrived in Quebec, such as publicly funded French language education. Canadian Confederation enabled the province of Quebec to establish a separate confession-based public school systems, forming English Protestant and French Catholic school boards. Through a series of legal battles, Jews were given the right to public schooling within the English Protestant system. When Francophone Jews arrived in Quebec, they were forced to attend public school in English or Jewish parochial schools that functioned in English and according to Ashkenazi traditions, the exception being Hebrew was also, would be half-day English, half-day Hebrew. The major wave of North African Jewish immigration to Montreal occurred between 1967 and 1980, coinciding with a time of massive change in Quebec politics. Through the Quiet Revolution, Catholic Francophone Quebecers were secularizing, modernizing, and nationalizing en masse. With a long history of discrimination under an Anglophone minority, Quebecers sought to improve conditions for Francophones in North America. The Parti Québécois thus formed with a mandate to create an independent Quebec nation with French as the national language. They were elected to government in 1976, the same year that the Association Séfarade Francophone became the Communauté Séfarade de Québec. This created a major crisis for Montreal's predominantly Anglophone Jews, triggering an exodus of young Montrealers to Toronto or Ottawa. With the mass arrival of Francophone Jews in that year, or in these years, the Ashkenazim were worried that the Sephardim would side with the Parti Québécois. Further, there was a huge language and cultural divide between the communities that made integration very difficult at first. The promotion of Francophonie in Quebec, combined with the diminished power of the Ashkenazi majority, created an environment where Sephardim in Montreal could develop their own communal infrastructure in parallel and partnership with the Ashkenazi organized Jewish community. This social political context makes Quebec a unique place to contemplate Sephardic Jewish identity. I would like to shift now to discussing my work on mapping Moroccan Jews in Montreal. This research is still in progress, so I will just show you some of my preliminary findings. In my mapping approach, I am inspired by the work of Michel Ducerteau. He argued for a movement away from the study of space as the cartography of a map or a bird's eye view that condenses and totalizes distance and obscures the everyday practices that occur inside spaces. He argued that the experience of walking in the city can become a practice of resistance against the totalizing gaze. A striking example of this is the varieties of paths Jewish synagogue goers might walk on Shabbat. Eitan Diamond demonstrated this in his study of the religious microspaces of Orthodox Jews in Thornhill, a suburb of Toronto. He demonstrated that multiple overlapping Jewish spaces exist within a single Jewish neighborhood. As one family walks to the Sephardic Kehillah Center, another to the Orthodox Bait, and another to Aish HaTorah, the outreach shul. Even families and individuals who walk to the same synagogue reveal difference in whether they arrive for the minyan at 7:30 in the morning with a reputation for a no-nonsense service for serious daveners, or at 9:15 for the Youth Minyan, which targets high school students from a less observant background. I was interested in mapping the Sephardic neighborhood. This is an abstract concept, and I wanted to do this through the walking pattern of a single individual. And I chose to begin this project by mapping Sami al-Maghribi. So who is Sami al-Maghribi? Salomon Amzalag. Salomon Amzalag was born in 1922 in the city of Safi on the Moroccan coast. Growing up in a traditional Jewish family, he learned the Moroccan Jewish liturgy at synagogue, but was never formally trained as a chazan. His family moved to Rabat, which had become the capital of Morocco under the French protectorate. Here he was exposed to a broad range of musical styles: piyutim, Jewish liturgical poetry, qasidas, classical Arabic poetry, and the classical music of Al-Andalus. Sami began to learn the Algerian repertoire of Andalusian music in Rabat from the masters who played there. At age 20, he decided to dedicate himself to music full-time and moved to Casablanca. He taught himself how to play the oud. He studied at the Conservatory of Music and created a band called Sami's Boys. He played in the clubs and theaters throughout Morocco and Algeria, sometimes touring with Oriental dancers or Muslim comedy troupes, and became a star of radio and television. It didn't hurt that he was very good looking. In 1967, Sami was invited by his friends in Montreal to audition for the position of cantor at the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. He accepted the position and moved his family to the Snowdon-Cotonej area. Proficient in music, he learned the German choral liturgy of the Spanish, which had followed the Ashkenazi style for many years. To hear him sing on recordings, there is barely a trace of his Moroccan accent. One of the conditions of accepting this religious post was that he would be able to continue to perform in secular venues. He did so at the Place des Arts and around the world. He also lived in Israel for a number of years in Ashdod and directed the Andalusian Orchestra, which brought together North African musicians trained by ear and Russian musicians trained by sheet music. He passed away in Montreal in 2008, and his wife, Messidi, passed away just this past year in Israel. This past February, I curated the exhibit Sacré Profane Sami al-Maghribi as part of an all-night arts festival called Nuit Blanche à Montréal. This was a collaboration between the Museum of Jewish Montreal, Fondation Sami al-Maghribi, and Dr. Yolande Cohen's research group Histoire, Femmes et Genre et Migration. Upon us was the challenge of making Sami's musical career accessible to young Quebecers, who might only understand Jews as Hasidim in Outremont, if they had ever met a Jew at all. Our exhibit combined a display of concert posters and sheet music from the Fondation Sami al-Maghribi archives, video projections, live musical performances organized by Yolande Amzalag, the president of Fondation Sami al-Maghribi, Moroccan Jewish food, courtesy of a Jewish pop-up dinner group called the Wandering Jew, and oral histories of Moroccan Jews' experiences of migration, courtesy of Dr. Yolande Cohen. To engage visitors further on the theme of migration, we included an interactive wall where visitors could write items that they would take with them if they had to leave their homes. Geography and maps were a crucial part of this exhibit. I think I have, oh yes, some pictures. Okay. So I would like to shift now to focus on mapping Sami al-Maghribi in Montreal. So what does the process of mapping make visible to us? These are some of the maps that we designed for the exhibit. This is an approximation of the neighborhoods in which Sami performed. And we did this based on, we had some content that we tried to figure out what was the location of the concerts, or where was the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, and then we approximated where they are on the island of Montreal. So now I'm going to show you another approach that is a little bit more precise with some other data. So for my research, I'm using an open source software called Mapbox to design my maps. Open source means that it is free for anyone to use and to help develop. It takes its data from places like OpenStreetMap, which unlike Google Maps, actually owns its content and will never be subject to copyright fees. So here is Montreal, and if we look broadly at the island, does anybody want to describe what the data points look like? What do you see on this map zoomed out in this way? Anybody? No? Stephen? Interestingly, that's what, if we know something about Montreal, we might think about that. But we're kind of seeing 3 points across the city of Montreal, it looks like 3 groups. It's actually kind of in the middle. Right, yes. Not in the West Island, not. So what's kind of interesting, this is why mapping is really interesting. From this broad scale, it looks like 3 locations. But I'm going to zoom in and we'll see how the scale of the map will make our data look a little different. So I'm zooming in now on the neighborhood of Snowden-Côte-des-Neiges, and this is where the majority of the data points that I've entered in are. There was 1 in Ville Saint-Laurent, there was 2 downtown, but when we zoom in on the scale, we see that our density is here. So this is the neighborhood that Salomon Amzalag lived and worked in. And the other blue dots on the map represent areas where he performed. So if I can zoom, so this point represents 1 location of the Amzalag family home here. Here's the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. This here is the Magan David synagogue where he worked after he retired from the Spanish. And here is the, 2 minutes, whoa. The Amzalag family bakery, Oriental Pastries. So what's kind of interesting about looking at mapping in this way is that we can see for an Orthodox Jew who worked at a synagogue, lived in this neighborhood, it's important to be able to walk to where you work or to walk to shul. So it's kind of an interesting way to look about the density of a Moroccan Jewish individual as a microcosm for the migration, Moroccan Jewish migration to this neighborhood in the 1970s. So since I only have 2 minutes left, I might just go forward. I'll show you one more thing. So how do we find addresses when we're doing the processes of mapping? We have an amazing resource here that's offered through the Bibliothèque et Archives Nationales, which is old phone directories. So if I want to know the address of a person or a location, I can search by last name or I can search by street. So when I was trying to find the exact location of the Oriental pastry shop, I thought it was called Kosher Oriental. I wasn't sure what exactly it was called, but I knew it was on Victoria. So I could find Victoria in the address book and kind of guess. And it's the only Oriental pastry shop in this neighborhood in the 1970s. And so I took a guess that this was probably the Amzalag family store. And what would be really interesting is that you here have access to all the last names of all the people in that neighborhood, so you can really see the Jewish density, but also the Moroccan last names. which is, I find really, really fascinating. So this project of mapping Moroccan Jewish history is part of a larger need to expand Sephardic, Mizrahi, and Arab Jewish studies in Canada and Jewish studies across the world. If Canadian Jewish studies is already a very small field, scholarship on Sephardi, Mizrahi, and Arab Jews is even more marginal. The language divide in Canadian scholarship has exacerbated this, such that Moroccan Jewish history in Canada has largely appeared in French language publications and inaccessible if you only speak English. Through my postdoctoral work, I'm trying to bridge this gap. Mapping Sami al-Maghribi helps to make visible part of Canadian Jewish and Quebec heritage that would still be sitting in stacks of boxes in somebody's basement if not for the dedicated work of people working to promote archives, public history, and Canadian Jewish studies.
We continue with Professor Yaron